Richard Fuller.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is a great pleasure to have listened to the contributions so far, not least the contribution just made by the Honourable Member for Liverpool Walton. And can I join him in echoing about the opportunity that there is for strengthening connections, particularly for our young people, between our country and countries in Latin and South America. I think it is often an area that is overlooked by government. It's an area that's not high on the list of what teachers and you learn in schools, and his calls on this issue, I think, are very, very welcome. I had the opportunity actually on Monday in Cambridge University to talk to a group of Argentinian politicians, and I know from their country's perspective this is something that they would welcome as well. Madam Deputy, can I ask, look, here's my point. It's an afternoon. We have plenty of time. It's an incredibly interesting and broad debate, and it will not have escaped your attention, Madam Deputy Speaker, that my benches are not crowded with participants, and therefore I would beg the indulgence of those opposite if I make a number of points in a series of areas to make up for the ones. And as the Minister is asking that they be quality contributions, I shall therefore make my speech even longer. I want to start with some of the points that were made by the chair of the Business Select Committee, who I think is one of the most talented members of this Parliament. But he and I do have some strong disagreements, sometimes on principle, sometimes on practice. So let me start with two words that encompass the fundamental disagreement that we have: industrial strategy. To the chair of the Select Committee, industrial strategy is the elixir that unlocks somehow the growth in our economy that proves elusive to all others. And not only that, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is industrial strategy as conceived by the Labour Party that somehow has this unique ability to generate growth that perhaps in other ways would not be accomplished. I will give way in a minute. And I've always found this intellectual position interesting, because when I went to business school and we were given a chance to give 3 words to describe ourselves to other members before we turned up, I decided to call myself arrogant, because actually, at that age, I know it's hard to believe now, I was quite arrogant. But I would never have the arrogance, Madam Deputy Speaker, to think that my perception, uniquely of an industrial strategy, was the right way to galvanise growth in this country. And in that issue, myself and the Chair of the Select Committee differ. I'd like to hear what he has to say.
Has, I think, put words in my mouth on the record, so I ought to just correct him, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker. Because from our work on the Select Committee on Industrial Policy and my comments surrounding that work, it should, I think, have been clear that I'm not somebody that believes the state is where wealth is created, that the state is at the driving seat of a growing economy. But what I do recognise is that where the private sector, which creates wealth, is trying to drive down the road at speed to compete, to win the race for their workers, their customers and their shareholders, if the road runs out, somebody needs to build the public infrastructure for them to succeed. And in that opportunity, the state has an important role to play in partnership with business. That's what I refer to as industrial policy. And might I say, that's why so many businesses are talking to the Labour Party right now, because they're asking for that type of partnership with the government, as opposed to just a government that stands out of the way and hopes the free market will solve all the problems.
Well, Madam Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is actually reinforcing my point. He talks about if a company has chosen to drive down a road and used its shareholder value money to drive itself down that road, that if the road runs out, somehow taxpayers should pay for the extension of the road. Well, the whole point about capitalist markets is that if you've made incorrect allocations of capital, it's your responsibility and your shareholders lose money. It is the job of business and business leadership to have the insight to understand how they can best create value for their shareholders in the long term. And they will come to members of the Labour Party. I will give way in a minute, but they will come to smart members of the Labour Party, desperate to try and show the Labour Party now have years of hating business, that somehow now they think prawn cocktails are a nice idea. They'll go to the Labour Party and say, can you spare us a few bob, mate? We'd like to support your party. We've got this really sexy part of what we want to do that, frankly, we don't want to use our own capital to do, but we know the Labour Party in government will be suckers to use taxpayers' money to pay for it. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, and as a former member of the same select committee, I hope he'll take this in good heart, because we visited just last week Hybrid in Sweden, which has made some incredible advances in creating sponge iron on the road to creating green steel. One of their major partners in that enterprise is Vattenfall, who are the state-owned utility company. It would not have been possible without them. So I'd ask him to take that into consideration. In addition, our version of this in this country is for vast amounts, hundreds of millions of taxpayers' money to be ploughed into the South Tees Development Corporation, transferring those assets to private individuals in return for options for land for buttons, leaving the state on the hook for the environmental remediations. You couldn't get a bigger contrast in a more intelligent response to some of these industrial challenges, and I trust he'll take that in good heart and look at the difference in the practices between the United Kingdom and Sweden on this occasion.
Madam Deputy, the honourable gentleman is exactly right. He and I would share the defence of taxpayers' money if it is going to be spent, that it should be spent wisely, and if a strategy is not working, where there's agreement to do it, that's fine. My point in raising this at the start was that you come from different points of view about whether industrial strategy per se is going to answer some of the problems. And my general position is that the market and businesses left to themselves, the free allocation of capital, open and competitive markets, has proven itself time and time and time again to be the best way to achieve progress with better living standards for households in this country and in countries around the free world. That is why we in the developed nations are the developed nations, is because we have supported that. I know the Madam Deputy Speaker is very lenient today, so I'll give way to the Honourable Lady, then to the Honourable Gentleman again.
Nobody, certainly not from the Liberal Democrats, would pretend that wealth creation is done by the state. It is done by business. But what business leaders are saying time and again is that government needs to set a direction. And is it not true that currently there is no direction, particularly when it comes to the green economy and the transition to net zero, that this government is purposefully giving to businesses?
Well, the Honourable Lady is right that businesses like certainty. That is absolutely true. And setting a direction in as much that it creates certainty is useful. I think a little bit more. No, that's fair. It's a very strong part of the foundation. I think as we talk a little bit more in this debate, and we talk more about climate change, the question about national strategies and international strategies, the issues between British businesses, other countries' businesses and multinationals will come into be some of the issues that will perhaps drive us apart again on what our response will be. I don't know if the leader of the Chair of the Select Committee wants to intervene again.
I just wanted to invite the honourable member to reflect, for the benefit of the House, on his recent involvement in the Conservative report about the reform of economic regulators, which I've had the courtesy of seeing before its embargo was lifted. And I don't know if the embargo has been lifted or not, so I won't talk about it directly. It has, so I can, very good. But of course it recognises in that report, and I'd invite the honourable gentleman to confirm or otherwise at this point, that industrial policy isn't just about money. It's about policy directions, we've heard. It's about regulation. It's about economic regulators. It's about creating the conditions in which business can prosper, entrepreneurs can create businesses, innovators can innovate. And industrial policy, as I refer to it, isn't, as the honourable gentleman has suggested, somebody in the Treasury writing a cheque and giving it out to businesses that should get their money from elsewhere. It's about the broader competitive market that needs to be created. And the government, of course, has a role. Parliament has a role in creating those optimal circumstances for businesses to succeed. Does he not recognise that?
I do, and I think the honourable gentleman, again, is showing that there is a number of areas here where the details we can find agreement on. And let me just focus on the point of regulatory policy, because it is important. There have been a group of Conservative MPs that have put together a report calling on the government to look at the way in which we deal with the stock of regulation, the process of making regulation, and my particular area of interest, which is the accountability of regulators for the performance. And the chair of the Select Committee will be well aware of our interactions with our regulators. They do have an effect. Effective regulation, and by that I mean regulation which is appraised regularly, systematically, and rationally, does play a role in the competitive advantages of the United Kingdom. It has been an area that we have sort of locked away as being something, well, it's not nationalisation and it's not free market, it's sort of, it'll do okay. Those days need to come to an end, because too much of our economic output is in sectors which are subject to regulators, and therefore the performance of those regulators directly affects the ability of our country. And I can see, if it doesn't mind me saying, I can see the Chair of the Select Committee nodding, and it's nice to have an area of agreement. But can I move on to the second area that he talked about, which was about the Inflation Reduction Act and the associated measures in the other measures in the EU. And this is the other part that I want to just testify. As he will well know, the Inflation Reduction Act was a $370 billion act in terms of the commitment of US federal funds, or the equivalent of US federal funds through tax credits, and that it was also following on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, which was $1 trillion of investment in infrastructure, but also in green energy. Now, purchasing power parity, the US economy is approximately 6 times the size of the UK. And so the equivalent funds that the Honourable Chair of the Select Committee was sort of saying we need to respond to is essentially a 40 billion, 50, 60 billion check that is needing to be written. And I'm just wondering if the point about industrial strategy isn't about expenditure, then what versus that amount of money are we supposed to be doing to compete, other than this is putting in existing funds? There seems to be a sort of a missing part there. The Honourable Gentleman also talked about inward investment and the fact that we should be sharpening up our act. And he's absolutely right, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I think we've seen a number of other countries, not just that he mentioned Germany, but there are other countries, where the package on offer, if you're interested in investing in that country, is not only a financial package, but is a coherence package. When you look to do inward investment in a country, there are people who will sort out all the intricacies of the government for you at a single point on day one. That's how the UK did it when Lady Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, was leading the efforts with Lord Young. I think over the intervening years, we've sort of made it a little too complicated. We haven't found our way there. And I'd be interested from the Minister if she can just talk about, I know it's not directly her remit, perhaps, but it is interesting, I think, for all members here to know, what is the actual government doing to make sure that people know the UK can get you from, as a foreign company, thinking you want to invest in this country, to getting going and investing in this country and getting bricks and mortar built, or whatever it may be, servers, etc. What can we do to make that easier? I know it looks like I'm picking the Honourable Member's speech apart. I'm not picking it apart, I'm actually asking questions about it, but he's happy we take on that. So, he talked about economic security and collaboration. I think the short-term version of this is called sort of friend shoring. What that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is essentially saying, let us do a geopolitical review of important strategic supply chains, and then let's be smart to make sure that we are doing business with those countries that are allies with us. Well, that's a big change. That is a massive change, because there is no clarity in doing that about what the extent of friend-shoring areas should be. Is it just in strategic industries that's determined by the United Kingdom? Is it imposed on the United Kingdom because other friends think that we shouldn't be doing business with someone else? Are we prepared as a country to outsource how British businesses do business to the government of the United States? No, I'm not. Yes.
I'm grateful to the Honourable for giving away. He's making an interesting point. But in terms of the critical areas of our economy, does he not agree that it makes consummate sense in areas such as energy security or perhaps the opportunities around carbon capture, utilisation and storage, to have those strong relationships with those neighbouring countries with whom we are aligned? We've got the spectre of Putin, of course, so much damage to us in energy security of late. Would it not be infinitely more sensible to look to the new technologies and look to those neighbours in this domain, this area, to work collaboratively together for our mutual economic benefit? Surely that makes sense.
So the Honourable, there are two parts of what the Honourable said. The first is, is it sensible for us to make sure we've got sensible national security and some of the things that are important for national security? I don't think there's too many concerns about that. The issue is, should we be focusing our policy on this issue of only or primarising going with our allies? And I think that is a problem. If this gets into the international discourse, and I think part of what the chair of the Select Committee was talking about was, perhaps unbundling the existing international organisation, paying the respect, but recognising the reality, quote unquote, I think, of what is happening, but then looking at ways that we can sort of do these side arrangements with our friends. When you do that, my fear is you are essentially pooling the understanding of what is a friend and what is not to others. And that is a substantial change in how this country would look to run its economy. My view is the United Kingdom should be an open society, an open trading economy, and that we should lean primarily to openness. We should look to, obviously not with Russia. The Honourable asked about Russia and China. And I would just make the point that we already have substantial trade sanctions on Russia, so I think there's a consensus in the House about when a country invades another country and we take a response to that. But then to conflate that with China, which has not, as far as I know, invaded another country, you move into a different area. So my point is, as a philosophy, the United Kingdom's history of success has been as an open trading nation, and this current push in this country and others for us to do friend shoring, it strikes me to be a very significant change from way historically we created wealth. Yes.
Grateful for the further intervention. The point I was alluding to in my opening remarks is to recognise with some humility that Britain can only have so much influence on these global trends. And he invites us to conclude in this debate that if we were to do more deals with our friends and allies, as I've suggested, that would be dictated by other countries, as I think he's alluding to the United States of America. My response to that is that Britain, therefore, should lead the debate and be involved in how this is developing across the world. Because if we do just sit back and wait to see what happens, we will end up in a circumstance where we've had no influence about how these things are being designed, and that by its very nature will be dictated by others who are leading the global debate. I'm suggesting that as a smaller country, we have global clout, and we should be convening and leading that debate.
Actually, that is a brilliant point, well made, and characteristic of the Honourable Gentleman's understanding and grasp of these issues. I think he's put his finger exactly where it needs to be on this issue. I think from my point of view, I am just raising the questions and the concerns about the perils of what others may see as somehow buttressing our national security, doing what's right by us. This is not a road you can go down without trade-offs, and there will be some significant trade-offs in doing it. But to be an active participant whilst those discussions are going on, I think is a very sensible suggestion. But back to the money again, and about the current issues of the US so-called Inflation Reduction Act and the EU. I would just make the current a couple of observations. A significant amount of these funds by other countries are being spent on what I would call competitive discovery. This is money to look at solutions where we don't have the solution to a problem yet. And so therefore I would put that at the higher end of the risk investment spectrum. And I think therefore I would be rather cautious. It's like the dot-com for the green era. Not in all sectors, and not all the money is going to that, but a substantial amount of what we need to do if we wish to achieve net zero does require that money gets spent on discovery of solutions. I'm just very leery that British taxpayers' money should be stacked up in competition with taxpayers' money from the European member states, taxpayers' money from the US. Because, again, just using that dot-com analogy, when there is a big rush of substantial amounts of funds into discovery on a global scale, yes, there are winners, but an enormous amount of capital is wasted on losers. And I fear that efforts where we hear, and we've heard it in the House in other debates, where people push to say, you know, we should be doing what President Biden is doing. We should be doing the same as the EU. Politicians need to remember in doing that, we're going to say we're taking taxpayers' money that could be spent on education or on healthcare, and we're going to put it in the casino of winners and losers in the green tech revolution. And I think we need to be very cautious about how we spend money on that. And I would make a further point. Yes, of course.
Gentleman for giving way, and I'm listening to his points with some deep interest. Would you therefore say then it would be more reasonable for the UK government to stop its fossil fuel subsidies, because we know where that's going, and we've been subsidising fossil fuels for generations, and putting that more directly into green inward investment?
The honourable gentleman tempts me to... So I thought, if I may answer in this way, in the 2017 election manifesto for the Labour Party, which was not a hugely successful document, but it had a second document put together by the then Shadow Chancellor, the Right Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington, where he enumerated all of the tax breaks that were given to different sectors of the economy. And it's an enormous sum. And I say this as someone who I think can claim that he's a low-tax conservative. A more efficient economy would get rid of almost all of them. And you would say, you're on your own. Carbon fuel sector, other areas, essentially you are on your own. Go to the market, raise the money you need from your own shareholders or from other investors who believe, if you haven't got investors, to grow your business. And that we really need to, if we want to get, and we've had comments and conversations about the level of debt, if we want, and the Right Honourable Gentleman is here, so he will correct me if I'm wrong. I read his document in 2017, I thought it was an excellent analysis, and I think the Labour Party's point in that election, one of the points they made, which was that we need to look at tax breaks to large corporations and sectors of the economy as a way of public spending, was absolutely spot on, and I think we don't put the right vigilance into doing that. And my own, free market point of view is the fairer the market, the lower the subsidy. Oh, yes.
As Madam Deputy Speaker, I wasn't going to engage in this debate, but I was passing by and heard reference to myself. Okay.
Order. I would normally, I would chastise the Honourable Gentleman for attempting to speak in a debate when he hasn't been present. But I happened to notice that he was actually in the chamber, although not in his normal place. And given that we're not under enormous time constraints this afternoon, I will be much more lax than I normally am. John MacDonald.
Thanks. Generous and wise as ever, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I just say briefly, just to reinforce what the Honourable Gentleman... The reason we were doing that piece of work is because we wanted to review every tax relief. In opposition, that's impossible to do. So we thought, if we go into government, that's exactly what we'll do. And the reason for that is because we were discovering there were tax reliefs that literally had been introduced decades earlier, that the Treasury had never reviewed for either their original purpose, whether it was achieved or whether they should be amended or whatever. And it became a way in which example after example came forward where the tax relief system wasn't working effectively as it was originally planned.
I'm very, very grateful for the right honourable gentleman taking part. I don't think I agree with anything else in the 2017 Labour Party manifesto, but that I think that the point that he has just made is a point for the ages for whoever is in the Treasury at the time. In addition to my concern about taxpayers' money, this big funding race between the EU and the US putting amounts of money at risk in a casino of green discovery is an open question about what is the trajectory of unit costs for the materials that will be required in those sectors that are going to assist us to achieve net zero. It is a natural human urge when others are rushing to do something that we feel we should rush to do it as well. We can all remember the shortages of toilet paper in the start of COVID, which was a shortage for no apparent reason whatsoever. It's just because everyone else was buying loo paper, everyone else thought they should buy loo paper. As we know, that then created a surge in unit costs, which then abated afterwards, and the cost of toilet paper is now back down. I haven't checked recently, but the cost of toilet paper is back down to where one would say would be a normal market price. As goes toilet paper, so goes the ingredients. Actually, I shouldn't use that phrase. That's probably not a good phrase. Or maybe it is. So goes potentially some of the unit costs for others, which is there will be a significant additional cost which will be spent on early adopters. And my question is, in this international trade area, are we better off participating in that surge in unit costs in an era of discovery, technological discovery, or are we better off keeping our money in our pocket until those unit costs and those unit costs have come down and those successful discoveries have been made? And then my final point on this is, remember that there will always be opportunities for economic gain and financial success, even if the initial discoveries and the bulk of investment is elsewhere. Because there will always be issues about international flows of trade. For example, the motor industry. In the 1940s, 1950s, most of the motor industry was in the United States, certainly in the 70s. So the UK benefited because they needed to reshore to the UK, and that would be the same in other sectors. And then look at slices of value added. If you look at where most of the iPhones are made in developing countries, most largely historically in China. Most of the value added is Apple's design, and the UK has advantages in these things. So, yes, we can be thoughtful about those areas, but I just wanted to put on the record some points of question for the chair of the Select Committee who called this welcome debate. I know that I'm testing everyone's patience by my opening remarks in this speech. I would just, therefore, if I can, just look at a couple more points and then maybe give time back to us. This tilts to the Indo-Pacific region, both through the trade arrangements, but also in the infrastructure, the global review that the government has come out with 2023, I think is a most welcome change. Much like the Honourable Member for Liverpool-Walton, who talked about the issues in Latin America. For myself, prior to getting involved in politics, I spent a lot of time in the Philippines, in Korea, and Australia. And it was clear that in those areas of the world, there's not only great opportunity for the United Kingdom, but there's also great recognition of the talents that we have and a great need for the various skills that the UK can provide, not only in economics, but also in defence and in other areas. And I think when I hear, when I hear politicians sort of poo-poo the impact of CPTPP as a small percentage of GDP, I worry that they're missing the deeper point. The deeper point is it is a bigger connection. It is part of a globalization of what the United Kingdom is, a recognition. Not the UK as a big global superpower, but the UK is seen by people around the world as having its place and having things to offer. And I think we should look at this trade agreement as just the start of us pushing further into that part of the world in all the ways that we can. And I yearn for the days where we can do a similar deal across Africa. Because trade with the countries in Africa, opening up our markets to goods and services that can come from Nigeria and Ghana, from South Africa, from Kenya and other growing markets, growing economies, is surely not only in our economic interests, but it is in the interests of humanity. The greatest benefit to humanity, in my view, in economic terms, over my lifetime, has been Nixon's visit to China and the redirection of China from Russia towards the West and the consequent movement of hundreds of millions of people in China and in the surrounding areas, actually, into the global trading system. And it has been a great sadness to me that the countries in the continent of Africa have not been part of that. And for this generation of politicians, for the next 10, 20 years, I would hope from our small part that we can play, that's something that we should be looking to do. Briefly, yes, of course.
So, since we have a little bit of time and we are debating quite seriously, does he not recognize that cutting ourselves off from the biggest trading partner in the world directly at our shores was directly in opposite of this vision of a global Britain? And does he not recognize that, of course, the European Union also seeks to be open to other trading blocs and other countries and other big nations across the world, and therefore Britain is losing out by having left the European Union?
Well, the Honourable Lady has made her point clear, and she asked me if I agree with her, and the straight answer is absolutely not. So for me, thinking ahead of the referendum in 2016, one of the most important reasons for me for why I felt we should look for a different arrangement with our EU colleagues was that I wanted us to focus on the trade and economic interests with a laser-like focus of the UK. And if I may make my point to the Honourable Lady, she can come back if she likes. In my view, and people can differ on these, but to my view, being part of the EU was a compromise too far in the pooling of those interests in an ever more competitive world. And that's one of the reasons why I felt it was right for us to leave. And beyond that, I would say that the subsequent reactions, and I would be critical of the UK in some ways, but certainly critical of the EU, in this sort of artificial period that we've now thankfully, I think, got past, where everyone was just trying to be difficult with everyone else. I'm very pleased that the Prime Minister, I think we all pleased the Prime Minister, has achieved with the Windsor Framework not just the resolution, in large part, of many of the concerns of that friction-full period, but also my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has indicated his desire that the UK and the EU should do precisely what the Honourable Lady opposite was seeking us to do, which is to work together where we can. But of course, in our position now, we do that primarily because it's our focused interests that we're looking to promote. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's been a pleasure to contribute to this debate. I have been very complimentary about the chair of the Select Committee, despite the fact that he is a Labour Member of Parliament. But I think he, by leading this debate in the way that he has demonstrated that there are substantial areas that we can agree on, even if fundamentally our philosophies may start from a different place.